The first preservation effort began in 1894 with the building of the D.O. house from a little stone house into a very large colonial revival house. And when you think about, at that time, just the ancestors or the living folks at that time coming together to say that these homes will be lost to history if we don't put some preservation standards into place to protect these other stone homes. That's a pretty amazing thing. It was I think the second oldest preservation organization that was created in New York State was Historic Huguenot Street, the first being Washington's headquarters. And I think when you think about it, to have the foresight to protect the houses back then maybe created a sense of importance for the other descendants that came through to make sure that these houses stayed protected too. I don't think you can talk about the history of the street without talking about Ken Hasbrook, and he did many great things for Huguenot Street. And so I think he's left an important legacy, and I would say he's done a tremendous amount. I think so many people, including my mother, rallied to kind of fundraise to build these houses and protect the street. Not build them, buy them, excuse me, to make sure that the whole street was protected, and there would be this continuous piece that Huguenot Street owned, not just residential houses in between that we couldn't incorporate, or that Huguenot Street couldn't incorporate into the village. So I think the descendants are a big part of why Historic Huguenot Street, but I actually think there was almost a new wave of foresight that came with the market crash in 2008 and 9. And, it was another kind of decision point where a lot of other houses were suffering at that point. The board at that time took very proactive steps to secure Huguenot Street. And again, I think this next wave of growth is just another remarkable part of its story. We're working on a strategic plan right now. It's a given to protect the houses, the artifacts, the stories, the collections. I think what's most exciting as a next step is to really define this as a destination, as a place. And I think there are ways to do that even for a living street. But I think having people get the sense that they've arrived is going to be another transformational moment for Huguenot Street. And I really look forward to seeing that signage and landscaping and maybe it's fences that are going to make this feel like it is a place. When I first remember Huguenot Street, it was kind of these very dusty homes that in some sense belonged to the ancestors, not the public. And I think that was a mistake in the early years for the descendants to position it that way. I think this is a treasure that belongs to everyone. And I think we've worked hard in the last 5 years to make sure that people in the community, that Huguenot Street becomes an important part of the community. And I think that's been the important first step. But actually making the houses come alive rather than just walking through the empty homes. I think bringing their stories to life with costumed interpreters is differentiating, is setting us apart from a lot of other historic sites, and that it's real people, and their real stories. Doesn't get much better than that. I think that we are shifting from a culture that recorded a lot in letters. No one's taking the time to construct a thoughtful letter, really kind of expressing a bigger perspective of what you're thinking about, or it's not just a snippet of, something happened today. It's more looking back over the past month or the past couple of weeks, what's impacted my life or what's happened. And I don't think we get that thoughtful communication anymore. And so I think capturing what people may have said in letters through something like this oral history project is really important. The other thing is, gosh, I wish we had had the technology to record these stories centuries ago, because we know so little, for example, about women's lives, particularly in the first 100 years of the settlement. I always talk about history. And women often didn't write. They often didn't have the time to write. They weren't encouraged to write. So, the journals and things were kept by men. We know more about their activities than we do women. There are snippets here and there that we can get. Later we get recipe books and journals, but in the early years there's really very little that records their lives. And the same is true for the enslaved Africans that were here. We know in fact, I think it was a part of the history of the street that certainly wasn't talked about for a very long time. And I'm so glad that we're bringing that story, I don't know if out is the right word, but I think it kind of is. It's been in the basements where the slaves were, and it's coming out now. So I think, but we don't know. In fact, in some ways we know more about the slaves because of the runaway slave notices about what they were wearing and what they may valued, but we don't know very much about women. I can't almost imagine what it's going to be like for people to be able to go back and look at something like this to get a sense of who someone was and why they were doing what they were doing and what their ancestry meant to them and why these buildings are important. So I hope it gives us a way to capture even more about the people that are living here. It's the stories that make the history come alive. It's the stories that we remember. And it's the story about my father putting the wreath on FDR's grave that, prompted me to call the Roosevelt Library and say, do you happen to have, I heard my father put this wreath on his grave at a remembrance for him. And they had photos of my father as the Boy Scout master, putting wreath on FDR's grave. So that connection of the stories, I never would have known about this had, those stories not been shared as a young child. And the fact that I could go to a historic place and get that piece of history about my father is remarkable. And that's what Huguenot Street is all about. It's so unusual that people know who they are. And, I think a lot of people are searching for that right now. And I think they were searching for it probably back in the 60s and 90s in these waves of growth for Huguenot Street. But I feel so blessed. I know where at least a part of my family came from. And that these amazing stone houses, that the amazing collections, that I can walk on the streets that my ancestors walked. I can see where they lived. And it isn't just special for descendants because it's such an important part of history, but at the same time, it's particularly important for those who are descended from the founders here. It's estimated that there are 30 million people that have descended from the founding families of New Paltz, and which is what Huguenot Street is. And when you think about it, it's a matter of math, but it's 10% of the U.S. population is descended from this small town. And so when you think about how so few people kind of know that connection and the potential for getting support for historic Huguenot Street, if we can find them, is incredible. And I think that's another important part of this project is this may trigger a story for someone, it may trigger a memory, it may inspire them to take a trip or to call or to find out more about Huguenot Street. But I think it would be so wonderful for the individual and wonderful for us to make that connection.